He was the son destined to rule an empire. Yet his death was so vile that official records softened every detail. How could a pampered heir, raised for unquestioned power, end up gasping for breath as something inside him decayed beyond recognition? What truly rotted his body, or the kingdom around him? Stay, because now you will uncover the horrific truth they hid about Henry VIII's most precious son. Prince Edward was born into a kingdom drenched in fear, ambition, and the ruthless will of his father, Henry VIII. From the moment he cried for the first time within those stone walls, England believed it had finally secured the future it had bled for. A legitimate male heir. A single child whose existence justified executions, annulments, broken alliances, and a trail of ruined lives. But behind the public celebration, there was an unspoken truth. Edward grew up not as a boy, but as a fragile artifact, one that could shatter at the slightest touch. His earliest years were spent in guarded chambers, where sunlight was measured and drafts were hunted like assassins. Servants whispered about his delicate frame, his frequent fevers, the way his ribs showed even when he was well fed. Yet the court insisted he was strong, perfect, divine. After all, how could they admit that the child Henry had torn his kingdom apart to obtain might be too weak to survive the weight of the crown? Every day, the boy was groomed for a destiny he physically struggled to hold. Tutors lectured him on statcraft, while physicians hovered in the background, watching for tremors, coughing, any sign his body was faltering. When he walked, he did so with a careful stiffness. When he rode, he tired quickly. Some blamed his sickly nature on the tumultuous pregnancies of his mother, Jane Seymour. Others blamed the sins of his father, believing the boy carried the cost of Henry's cruelty in his bloodstream. No one dared speak this aloud, of course. Fear was as present in the palace as the tapestries on the walls. But even with frailty woven into his existence, Edward possessed sharp intellect and an isolating maturity. He understood from childhood that his survival was not just personal, it was political. The ambitions of powerful men coiled around him like vines, each tugging in a different direction. Who would control the throne if he faltered? Who would shape England in his name? Who would rule through him? His body might have been weak, but his awareness was razor-edged. He could see the hunger in their eyes. The pressure intensified as he grew older. With each passing year, the kingdom waited for signs that their heir was becoming the king they needed. Yet instead of strength, Edward began to show Crack's quiet signs at first, subtle shifts that only those closest to him could detect. Shortness of breath after minor exertion. A lingering cough he dismissed with polite embarrassment. Nights in which he struggled to sleep because sharp pains racked his chest. Still, the court crafted illusions. Portraits painted him with healthy cheeks. Decrees proclaimed his vigor. Henry himself commanded silence about any rumor concerning his son's health. But disease doesn't bend to royal authority. When Edward entered adolescence, his symptoms intensified with a violence no one expected. His cough deepened, turning wet and harsh. His voice, once steady, began to strain. His bones seemed to ache constantly. Sometimes he felt as if something inside him was tightening, shrinking his lungs, stealing his breath inch by inch. And yet, outwardly, he continued his royal duties, determined not to be seen as weak, determined not to be replaced, determined not to disappoint the father who believed an heir was more important than a child. By the time Henry VIII died, the young prince's body was already a battlefield. And now, as King Edward VI, barely 9 years old, every flaw in his health was an open invitation for those circling the throne. Every cough could shift the balance of power. Every fever could spark a conspiracy. His body was no longer just failing him. It was threatening to plunge an entire kingdom into chaos. And deep within the palace, behind closed curtains, the rot was already beginning. Before we continue, if you're drawn into this hidden history, Subscribe so you never miss stories that textbooks soften or erase. And tell me, do you think Edward's fate was sealed from birth or shaped by the dangerous world he inherited? Edward's coronation was meant to be a triumph, a validation of everything England had endured for a male heir. But beneath the cheers, there was something unsettling and unease that clung to the air like damp fog. Those who stood closest to the boy noticed how his breaths came shallow, how his shoulders rose with effort, how exhaustion flickered in his eyes, even as the crown was placed upon his head. The kingdom saw a new monarch. But those within arm's reach saw a child already losing a silent war against his own body. As weeks passed, the pressure around Edward intensified. He was no longer just the heir. He was the embodiment of the entire Tudor dynasty's future. His every step, every appearance, every cough was analyzed by advisors who pretended loyalty while calculating the consequences of his decline. Two factions quickly formed around him: the protectorate under his uncle, Edward Seymour, and the opposing forces loyal to the ambitious John Dudley. To them, the frail king was not a leader, he was a vessel. Whoever controlled Edward controlled England. Edward tried to assert his authority, but the strain was relentless. His lessons doubled, his audiences expanded, and he was pushed to perform strength he could not maintain. He often masked his pain behind etiquette, straightening his posture even when his ribs felt like they were grinding together. Courtiers whispered that he looked pale. Physicians noted the discoloration in his skin, the eerie hollowness in his cheeks. But public announcements always spoke of momentary ailments, seasonal colds, and adolescent fatigue. In truth, something far more sinister was happening inside him. His cough, once mild, began leaving streaks of red on his handkerchief. He hid them carefully, folding the fabric so no one could see. At night, he sometimes woke choking, feeling as if the air had become thick and elastic. He clutched his chest, gasping, refusing to call for help. He feared the consequences of being watched too closely. He feared becoming a mere puppet. More than anything, he feared being replaced, because kings who could not serve did not live long in Tudor England. Yet the court continued its pageantry, insisting that the young monarch's vigor was increasing. They dressed him in heavy robes that made him sweat, then claimed the flush on his cheeks was proof of good health. They paraded him on horseback through London, ignoring the way he leaned forward as if trying to draw more air. They forced him to listen to endless disputes between nobles whose ambitions surpassed their loyalty. Each day took something from him: energy, breath, time. And then came the winter that began unraveling him completely. That season brought a cold so piercing that the palace itself seemed to shiver. Edward developed an unshakable fever, one that left him trembling beneath blankets. His coughing fits worsened, tearing at his lungs until blood dripped from the corners of his mouth. At moments, he felt as if liquid was filling his chest, drowning him slowly. His attendants urged him to rest, but the council demanded appearances. A sick king was weakness. A confined king was vulnerability. He forced himself to attend meetings, sitting upright while pain radiated across his back like needles. When he spoke, his voice rasped, but he hid the agony behind formality. Some advisors exchanged anxious glances. Others hid smiles. Those who craved power saw opportunity ripening in front of them. His body was betraying him, and every cough tightened their invisible grip. Despite worsening symptoms, physicians failed to agree on a diagnosis. Some believed it was tuberculosis. Others insisted it was a wasting fever, or an infection of the lungs, or even divine punishment. Remedies became increasingly desperate bleedings, purgatives, strange concoctions that left him nauseated and weaker. None of it helped. If anything, the treatments accelerated his collapse. His body, already fragile, was being drained of what little strength it had left. By early spring, his condition was impossible to hide. Servants noticed blood on his pillows. His robes hung loosely, as if draped over a skeleton. He struggled to walk across a room without stopping to catch his breath. Yet the council still refused to acknowledge the truth. Instead, they crafted optimistic bulletins, insisting the king was recovering steadily, even as Edward himself could barely stand. But the boy king wasn't blind to his own deterioration. He felt the weight of mortality every time he lay down and heard the crackling sound inside his chest, like wet parchment being torn apart. He felt it when he tried to pray, but became too winded to finish. He felt it when he looked at his reflection and saw the face of someone twice his age staring back, sunken, ghost-like, fading. His final attempts to maintain control of his kingdom only intensified the pressure on his failing body. As Seymour and Dudley battled for dominance, Edward became the center of a political storm he could no longer withstand. Every day, his health diminished further, but the fight for power around him only grew more vicious. He was no longer a ruler. He was a throne on legs, collapsing inch by inch. And then came the moment when the illness revealed just how merciless it truly was. When the first signs of internal decay made themselves visible in a way the court could no longer ignore. The first undeniable sign that Edward's illness had entered a grotesque new stage appeared on a morning that should have been routine. Attendants approached his chamber, expecting to help him dress, but instead found the young king sitting rigidly on the edge of his bed, clutching his ribs with trembling fingers. His nightshirt clung to him, soaked not only with sweat, but with a strange, sour odor, an odor no one dared name, but one that hinted at something far more disturbing than fever. When he attempted to stand, his knees buckled. One attendant rushed forward to steady him, and Edward whispered something that chilled the man to the bone. "My body feels like it is breaking from the inside." From that day forward, the physical decline accelerated brutally. His coughs no longer brought only flecks of blood, but thick, discolored mucus. Sometimes he would lean forward, gasping, and a rattling sound echoed from his chest, wet, heavy, unnatural. His skin changed too. It became papery, almost translucent, stretched tightly over bones that jutted like the frame of a collapsing tent. Dark blemishes began to appear along his arms and legs, mottled patches almost bruise-like, as if his flesh were losing its vitality. Servants exchanged uneasy glances, but were forbidden to speak. Despite these horrors, the council maintained its facade. They forced Edward to make limited appearances, covering his pallor with powder, hiding the tremors in his hands beneath embroidered sleeves. Yet even the finest garments could not mask the slow distortion of his posture. The boy who once walked with cautious dignity now moved as if each breath carved into him like a blade. And the stench, subtle at first, began to linger on his clothes, a faint but unmistakable hint that something inside him was deteriorating in a way no one dared confront. By early summer, the monarchy had turned into a theater of denial. Bulletins proudly declared that the king is improving, while within the palace walls, Edward's attendants feared touching him too firmly, terrified his bones might snap. His appetite vanished entirely. Meals went untouched. Each swallow triggered a spasm in his chest, so violent his whole body seized. His eyes, once bright with determination, now carried a distant glaze, as if he were staring not at the world, but beyond it. Worst of all was the breathlessness. Sometimes he would sit upright in bed, clutching the sheets, his lips turning blue as he struggled to inhale. It felt, he confided to his closest servant, as though something thick and invisible were expanding within him, compressing his lungs, squeezing out his life bit by bit. The servant tried to reassure him, but Edward only shook his head. "There is something inside me that grows," he whispered. "Something that does not belong." Doctors were summoned again and again, but their remedies became increasingly frantic. They applied hot plasters to his chest until his skin blistered. They bled him until he grew faint and disoriented. They forced vile concoctions into him, insisting they would purge the illness. But each treatment only worsened his suffering. His veins collapsed. His breathing became harsher. His skin grew colder. Whatever was consuming him was far beyond their understanding or ability. In the council chambers, however, the focus was not on saving the boy king, it was on preparing for what his death would mean. John Dudley, calculating and relentless, recognized that Edward's demise would not be a distant possibility, but an imminent reality. And in that reality, lineages mattered. Succession mattered. Power mattered. Edward's body was failing, but his signature was still valuable. Dudley began nudging the young king toward decisions that would reshape the future of England, decisions Edward was too weak to fully question. During this time, the humiliation of his condition weighed heavily on him. There were moments when attendants were forced to carry him because his legs trembled uncontrollably, moments when he coughed so violently that blood sprayed onto the floor, moments when the smell of decay emanating from his own body made him turn away in shame. The final humiliation came when he noticed his fingernails beginning to discolor yellowing, cracking at the edges as if even those small parts of him had begun to rot. And through it all, Edward tried to maintain dignity. He still attempted to read scripture. He dictated notes about religious reforms. He tried to write, though his handwriting deteriorated into shaky scratches. But every attempt drained him. He was no longer a king in control. He was a prisoner inside a collapsing body, kept alive only because those around him needed his existence a little longer. The breaking point arrived one night when a violent fit seized him. He clawed at his throat, eyes bulging, struggling desperately for air. Attendants rushed to his side, but Edward could barely speak. The pain was unbearable. His face turned ashen, his breathing shallow and rapid. Blood spilled from his mouth in a flow that terrified even the hardened physicians. It was clear that his lungs were not merely infected, they were deteriorating, breaking down, dying inside him while he still lived. That night marked a shift. The palace no longer smelled of incense and polished floors. It smelled faintly of sickness, of sweat, of the accelerating decay of a child who had been asked to bear a kingdom on shoulders too weak to carry his own weight. And still, England was told he would recover. But behind the locked doors of his chamber, Edward knew the truth. He was running out of time, and the political predators circling his throne were running out of patience. The next chapter of his nightmare would not be defined only by disease, but by betrayal. As Edward's body deteriorated, the palace transformed into a battlefield of whispers. His illness was no longer something that could be disguised with powder or hopeful bulletins. Everyone who crossed the threshold of his chamber left with terror in their eyes. The young king's breath rattled like torn fabric. His skin clung to his skull so tightly that his cheekbones seemed sharpened from within. His chest rose and fell in desperate, uneven jerks. And that faint scent, sweet, damp, unmistakably rotten, had become impossible to ignore. It clung to his bedding, seeped into the curtains, lingered in the hall outside his door. Those closest to him feared the truth. The boy was dying in the most harrowing way imaginable, as if his lungs were breaking down cell by cell, liquefying inside him. But the council refused to face this reality. Their ambitions had grown too tangled around the throne to allow the king's suffering to interrupt their calculations. The closer Edward came to death, the more frantic their political maneuvering became. John Dudley, now the most powerful man in England, saw Edward's decline as both a danger and an opportunity. He needed the king alive just long enough to secure the future he desired. Henry VIII will place Mary and Elizabeth next in line, but both posed threats to Dudley's power, especially Mary, whose religious loyalties would overturn every reform Edward had supported. Dudley understood that the dying king could still sign documents, even if his hand trembled, even if he coughed blood between every breath. One evening, when Edward was too weak to lift his head, Dudley entered his chamber with calculated softness. He spoke of preserving the kingdom's true faith, appealing to the boy's fierce Protestant beliefs. He painted Mary as a looming danger, a ruler who would undo everything Edward had tried to build. And then, with gentle insistence, he placed before him a new document, devised for the succession, that would disinherit both Mary and Elizabeth, placing Lady Jane Grey, Dudley's own daughter-in-law, on the throne. Edward wanted to appear strong, to show that he was still king, so he forced his trembling fingers to curl around the quill. He attempted to write, but the letters came out shaky and uneven. At one point, his vision blurred so severely that he nearly dropped the quill. Blood dripped from his nose onto the parchment, smudging a line of ink. Dudley quietly slid a fresh sheet forward. Edward tried again and again, determined to prove that his mind was still sharp even as his body collapsed. He finally managed to scrawl his intentions. It was an act that would plunge England into chaos, but in that moment, Edward believed he was safeguarding the realm. By that time, the boy king's suffering had reached a grotesque intensity. His fevers returned in violent waves, roasting him from the inside. His coughs turned ragged and wet, tearing at his throat until he tasted blood constantly. Dark circles blackened the skin beneath his eyes. He vomited after nearly every attempted meal, his body too weak to digest even small amounts of food. His bones protruded sharply beneath his skin, as if trying to escape the decaying flesh around them. Perhaps most horrifying was the change in his voice. Once clear and articulate, it had become faint, thin, and airy, like a person choking on smoke. Talking required tremendous effort. Sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, he would gasp and cling to the bed frame, his lips turning pale as he fought for breath. Physicians claimed his lungs were filling, though they refused to elaborate on what exactly was filling them. But Edward felt the weight, the pressure, the liquid suffocation slowly drowning him, even when lying upright. Servants began to avoid his chamber, unless summoned. Some fainted at the sight of him. Others prayed silently as they entered, fearing they were looking upon a corpse that still happened to breathe. Dudley, however, became a constant presence. Not out of compassion, but desperation. He encouraged Edward to finalize the succession plan. He spoke as if Edward would recover, yet his eyes revealed the truth. He needed the king to live only long enough to make his family the future of England. And with each passing day, the boy's signature became more precious. But betrayal was not limited to Dudley. Even among Edward's own attendants, alliances shifted. Messages intended for his half-sisters were intercepted. Reports about his condition were altered or hidden. The palace had turned into a nest of schemes, each one feeding on the body of its dying ruler. Eventually, Edward realized his room had grown strangely quiet. The laughter, the footsteps, the bustle of attendants, all had faded. People feared being near him. Even his physicians entered less frequently, afraid of admitting what was happening inside his chest. One night, as Edward struggled to speak, he asked a servant why no one came anymore. The servant hesitated and softly replied, "They say your illness cannot be stopped." Edward closed his eyes. Then they should not hide from me, but they did, because the sight of him was unbearable. The smell of him was undeniable, and the sound of him gasping for breath was the rhythm of a death the kingdom was not ready to face. In the days that followed, the political storm outside his chamber walls reached its violent peak. But inside, the boy king lay dying abandoned by those who once praised him, manipulated by those who needed him, and tormented by a disease that consumed him more brutally each hour. Yet there was still one final twist to his suffering, one last grotesque stage the court would try desperately to hide. By the time Edward entered the final stage of his illness, the transformation of his body had become almost unrecognizable. What had begun as a simple cough had evolved into something so gruesome that even the most seasoned attendants struggled to remain in his presence. His skin had taken on a waxy, grayish pallor stretched thin over his bones. His cheeks were hollow caves. His eyes, once sharp and intelligent, now sank deeply into his skull, ringed by bruised shadows. Every inhalation seemed to scrape through broken glass. Every exhalation carried the faint, sickly odor of decay. But the most horrifying change was what had started happening within his chest. Edward's lungs were deteriorating so rapidly that physicians believed parts of them had begun to break down, liquefying into infected fluid that filled his airways. Whenever he coughed, chunks of viscous yellow-green matter surged into his throat, sometimes streaked with blackened blood. Attendants had to wipe his mouth constantly, but even then, they could not keep pace with the relentless flooding inside him. The sound of his breathing, wet, ragged, bubbling, echoed through the room, a constant reminder that he was drowning slowly in his own failing organs. Even as his body collapsed, the charade of royal optimism continued outside his chamber. Bulletins insisted he was recovering, a lie so grotesque that many wondered if the council had gone mad. But the truth was simple. The political architecture built around Edward required him to be alive until circumstances were perfectly aligned. And Dudley, clinging desperately to the last scraps of his influence, attempted to maintain control even as the king drifted further from consciousness. Inside the room, the atmosphere was suffocating. Windows were kept closed to prevent drafts, but this only trapped the odor of sickness, the sourness of sweat, the iron tang of blood, and the unmistakable scent of organic decay. It clung to the walls. It settled into the sheets. It wrapped itself around Edward like a shroud. There were moments when his awareness flickered back to life with startling clarity. During one such moment, he attempted to sit upright, but the effort sent waves of agony through his chest. His spine curved unnaturally, as if the muscles supporting it had weakened beyond function. He grabbed at the bedposts, gasping, before collapsing back onto the pillows, trembling violently. With what little voice he had left, he murmured, "Is this how a king dies?" No one in the room dared respond. Soon after, his fingers began to discolor. First the nails, turning dark and brittle. Then the skin, taking on a purple-blue tint, especially around his extremities. Circulation was failing. His body was shutting down piece by piece. Even the simplest acts, lifting his hand, opening his eyes, swallowing, became monumental tasks. The final humiliation came when his body could no longer expel the fluid in his lungs efficiently. It gathered faster than he could cough it out. At times he choked on it, drowning in thick waves of his own internal decay. Attendants had to tilt his body to help him breathe, but even then, he sometimes lost consciousness mid-cough, only to awaken moments later in a panic, clawing weakly at the air as if fighting an invisible weight crushing his chest. By now, even Dudley avoided the chamber. He had gotten what he needed, the device for the succession, and now focused on mobilizing support for Lady Jane Grey. Edward, once the center of every political calculation, had become inconvenient, his death inevitable. The court around him, once bustling, now moved like shadows. They whispered outside the door, but rarely entered. The young king felt it, the abandonment, the turning away, the quiet acceptance that he was no longer someone to be saved, but someone waiting to die. In rare lucid moments, he stared at the ceiling with a hollow expression, as if recognizing that his life, which had been shaped entirely by others, was ending the same way. On the last night of June, the worst episode yet struck him. He coughed so violently that blood sprayed across the sheets. His throat tore. His lungs convulsed. His eyes bulged as he clawed at his own chest in a futile attempt to release the crushing pressure within. When the fit subsided, he lay gasping, barely conscious, his breaths shallow and irregular. Something inside him had ruptured or dissolved. No physician dared speculate. From that moment on, he slipped rapidly toward the end. His voice faded into a faint rasp. His vision blurred. His limbs grew cold, his pulse weakened into a flutter. He muttered prayers, though the words were nearly impossible to understand. His body was failing entirely, but his suffering, for reasons the court would never admit, was still not over. Because what happened next, in his final hours, would be so disturbing that official accounts softened, altered, or buried the truth entirely. Before we move to the final chapter of this tragedy, if you're still with this story and want more histories hidden behind polished narratives, subscribe. Your support is what keeps these dark corners of the past visible. And tell me, do you believe the court truly cared about Edward's life, or only the power his death threatened to unleash? Edward's final hours were a descent into a kind of horror that even Tudor chroniclers' men accustomed to plague pits, battlefield corpses, and the brutality of Henry VIII refused to describe truthfully. They wrote of a Christian passing, a peaceful end befitting a young king. But the reality, whispered behind locked doors and buried in private letters, was far darker. What happened to Edward's body as it reached its final breaking point was so grotesque, so viscerally disturbing, that those present spent the rest of their lives avoiding any mention of it. By early morning on the 6th of July, the young king had slipped in and out of consciousness for nearly a full day. His breaths were rapid, rattling, and uneven. A faint foam-pale pink from mingled blood gathered at the corners of his mouth. His chest rose weakly, then fell with a shudder. Each inhalation seemed to stop halfway, as if blocked by something thick and immovable deep inside him. His eyes, half open, stared upward without focus. Attendants hovered nearby, praying he would not choke again. But then the most terrifying phase began. Edward suddenly jerked upright, or as upright as his broken body could manage. His face contorted, eyes wide with panic. He grabbed desperately at his throat, fingers clawing at his own skin as though trying to rip something out from within. A harsh, gurgling gasp escaped him, so violent that the attending physicians stumbled backward. The boy was suffocating, not gently, not quietly, but violently, drowning in the collapse of his own lungs. What came next turned the chamber into a scene of horror. Edward coughed a single explosive cough and expelled a mass of dark, foul-smelling fluid onto the floor. Those closest recoiled. The stench was unbearable. The odor of rot that had been building inside him now released into the air. His lungs were not merely infected. They were decaying, breaking down, filling with necrotic tissue that his failing body could no longer contain. His attendants rushed forward to support him, but touching him was like lifting a body made only of brittle sticks. His spine curved sharply, as though the muscles had liquefied. His limbs trembled uncontrollably. His fingernails, dark and cracked, dug into the sheets as he tried to draw breath, but his lungs only produced that horrific bubbling sound like boots sinking into swamp mud. And then came the final seizure. His back arched with unnatural force. His eyes rolled upward. His mouth opened in a silent scream before another torrent of blood surged up his throat. His body convulsed in short, jerking motions, each one weaker than the last. Attendants called for physicians, for priests, for anyone, but the room was rapidly emptying as panic overtook them. Few had the courage to remain in the presence of such raw, unmasked suffering. In his last conscious moment, Edward whispered something barely audible, a gasp shaped into words. To this day, no record agrees on what he said. Some claimed he muttered a prayer. Others insisted he asked if God was angry with him. One servant, shaken for life, swore the king whispered, "Let me breathe." After that, his chest rose once more. Then again, slower. Then it stopped. But even death refused to give him dignity. Almost immediately, his skin changed tone, darkening rapidly in a way no physician could explain. Warmth fled his body with unnatural speed. The scent of decay that had clung to him in life now filled the chamber, heavy and unavoidable. His lips turned dark purple. Blood trickled from his nose and ear. His body stiffened so quickly that attendants struggled to straighten him. Some believed that whatever had been destroying him internally had continued even after his final breath. Outside, the council announced that King Edward VI had passed peacefully, surrounded by comfort and strengthened by faith. It was a lie. Because the truth, they could never allow the public to know was that the most prized son of Henry VIII had died in a state of agony so graphic, so grotesque, that even his enemies would not have wished it upon him. His final hours were a portrait of a body failing in the most horrific way, a child consumed from within by a disease no physician of the time understood. Within 9 days, Lady Jane Grey would be proclaimed queen. Within 13, Mary would challenge her. Within months, the realm would fall into chaos and bloodshed. But Edward, frail, brilliant, pressured, abandoned, would remain forever frozen in those final moments. A boy forced to carry the ambitions of an empire on lungs that could barely sustain his own life. A prince born to rule, a king destroyed from within, and a death far more horrific than history ever dared to tell.